Fáilte farú na fáilte road arás hig my channel YouTube. Today I'm going to do something very different from what I've done so far. That is to say, I'm going to do the video in English. And I'm going to do the video in English because several people have asked me to do some of the videos that I've done so far again, but in English for a wider audience. And this time I want to look at Rathlin Irish and give a little bit of an introduction to Rathlin Irish. I don't know how far I'll get today, but let's see. First of all, let's start not at the beginning, but at the end. Rathlin Irish is extinct, and it became extinct in the 21st century with the death of Alex Morrison, who died in 2012. Alex was a semi-native speaker, perhaps. He wasn't particularly fluent in the Irish language, but he did have a very large vocabulary in the Irish language, and also a huge number of place names in the Irish language from Rathlin Island. Now, both have been collected, and a lot of recording was done with Alex Morrison. Alex was born in the upper end of Rathlin Island in 1915. He was perhaps the last child not to have heard the Irish language, but to have heard the Irish language enough to have learnt it to an extent as a first language. 2012 obviously is well into the 21st century. I don't think Alex ever heard the Irish language spoken as a community language in Rathlin, but certainly as a language of individuals and families. The last native speaker to live in Rathlin Island was Frank Craig, who was born in 1895. He was still alive in 1970. I don't know when exactly Frank died, but he was still alive in 1970. His parents, or at least his father, did deliberately speak to him in Irish. He was brought up in Irish, but he had, to a large extent, lost the Irish language throughout his life, through a lack of practice, I suppose. It was strange when you listen to recordings of Frank Craig speaking. Sometimes he can speak Irish, but I don't know if he's fully aware or what was he fully aware of what he was saying. Very similar to another native speaker who lived in Rathlin all his life, and that was Bob McCormick, who was born in 1882 and died in 1962. He was from the lower end, and again, he's been recorded, and that's a very valuable recording, even though there isn't an awful lot to it. For the simple fact is that there were slight dialectical differences between the upper end and the lower end. That might be hard to believe today, but there was once maybe more than 1,200 people living in Rathlin, maybe even more. And those people lived in different townlands and were spread throughout the island, and that was enough population for different dialects of the language to develop in the island. Now, when we look at the decline of the Irish language, that can't be divorced from the decline in population, the decline in the island itself. You can't go from 1,200 people to, 70 people at one stage without losing an awful lot of people, and most of the native speakers obviously moved away. Now, two of those native speakers who moved away, one was born in 1891, the other in 1882. That was Donald John Ruy, or Daniel McCurdy, and Johnny John Ruy, or John McCurdy. They were two native speakers, and they were very important native speakers for the study of Irish because they continued to speak the language to each other throughout their lives. They lived on the mainland near Ballycastle. They were recorded. They weren't recorded, yes, by RTE, and they were also studied by a man called Heinrich Wagner, who wrote the Linguistic Atlas and Survey of Irish Dialects, and that's a very important document, I suppose. Now, they had a sister, Bella John Ruy, Isabel McKenna, Isabel Nicurdy, who was born in 1894 and who died in 1984 in Twinbrook in Belfast. Again, a native speaker. Very much a native speaker, but someone whose Irish was slightly rusty, I suppose, towards the latter end of her life. As she said, if I get something wrong, there's no one left to ask. So those are like people who, some of the last native speakers, all of those people have been recorded speaking Irish in one way or the other. But with the exception of Alex Morrison, they were all born before 1900, even though they lived well into the 20th century. And to the latter half of the 20th century. What happened? What happened somewhere before the year 1900? Before 1900, it seems almost all children in Rathlin were brought up, exposed to Irish, or brought up deliberately with Irish. And after that, it seems that there was only one that we know of, and certainly the language, whilst there were many native speakers in the 1940s, for example, the language had fallen out of community use, and even native speakers who were brought up with the language in Rathlin no longer used it. Well, how did that come about? Well, obviously, we talked about the school, the loss of the population, which is one way that which language shift occurs. The entire language is either physically destroyed or the people all move away. Now that has happened twice in Rathlin. First with the entire destruction of the population, and secondly with the almost complete emigration of the population, which had huge effects on the Irish language in Rathlin. And as well as that, like everywhere else, the school in Rathlin Island taught only in English, which gave people the opportunity to change language, I suppose you could put it that way. What happened around 1900 or just before that? Well, it's something we very rarely talk about, but I suspect that there was what we call the loss of the monoglot. Simply that people who couldn't speak English, or who couldn't speak English well, and therefore had to speak Irish, they simply passed away. And because of that, the people who were bilingual, who could speak English just as well as Irish, could simply speak English all the time, and therefore children were not exposed to Irish, and children were not deliberately brought up in Irish until you get to 2012 and the language becomes entirely extinct. So that's a potted history of the Irish language in Rathlin. You could go into a lot more detail about it. Now, I have a great interest in the Irish of Rathlin Island. This is a little book that I put out, Gaelc, Rathlin Irish. It's small. There are 5 tiny mistakes in it. There are typos. If anybody wants to contact me, I'll tell you what they are, because I don't want anybody who has the book not getting the full use about it. I wanted to make sure that there was something on the shelves about Rathlin Irish. I'm a journalist. I'm not a linguistic scholar, so I have to put that out there. But I wanted to do something very interesting in the dialect. Unfortunately, I'm almost by myself in that. Not many people are interested in the dialect of Rathlin Irish. Now, I suppose there are reasons for that. There are dialectical reasons for that. It's somewhat beyond the pale as an Irish dialect. There was never much interest in the dialect. Irish language organisations weren't overly interested in the dialect of Rathlin. Scholars weren't overly interested in the dialect of Rathlin. The greatest book we have on the Irish of Rathlin, which is called The Irish Language in Rathlin Island, was written by a man called Niels Homer, who came from Norway, if memory serves, and that's pretty much freely available on the internet if anybody's interested. So, Irish in Rathlin was quite distinct from the Irish language today. There's a great quote from a Rathlin man. I can understand Donegal Irish with ease and Scottish Gaelic with difficulty, but neither understand me. And I think there's a bit of exaggeration in that, but there's a lot of truth in it too. The nearest relative to Rathlin Irish was, unsurprisingly, the Irish of the Glens of Antrim, and then you go on to South Derry, etc. The nearest Scottish dialect to Rathlin was the Irish of Arran, the Gaelic of Arran, the Gaelg of Arran in the Clyde. People always ask, well, why was Rathlin not more similar to the Gaelic of Kɔnjéəskəɾ, of Kintyre, when it was so much closer? Well, in a sense, that may be a mystery, but we suspect that the missing link between Rathlin and Scotland was actually Galloway. And that's a dialect which we don't know an awful lot about, but we do suspect that Rathlin Irish may actually be a relic of Galloway, and that there may have been population movements, refugees, etc., through the Glens of Antrim to Rathlin Island. That's in folklore. It's also a linguistic theory. I think there's a lot to say for it. But again, I don't really want to get into too much speculation about that. But suffice to say, to Scottish Gaelic ears, Rathlin still sounds very Irish. To Irish ears today, Rathlin sounds very Scottish. It is, I suppose, halfway between Scottish Gaelic and Irish Gaelic, if you want to think about it like that. Although, when you consider where it sits, it should sound and it should be a lot more Scottish than it actually is. And again, there are historical reasons for that. Links with the Glens of Antrim, for example, people coming and going from Ballycastle, for example. And as well as that, of course, there were links to Kintyre and Arran, and those dialects that existed there and which had died out very, very recently, were a lot more Irish than, say, the Gaelic of the Outer Hebrides today. So that's kind of a potted history, a potted view. There's so much we could talk about, so much I could talk about Rathlin. I really don't know where to start, but I always think when you talk about any language, when a form of language, that you should start with the basic phrases, and I'll take you through the basic phrases. Now, I'm acting here. I'm not obviously a native speaker of Rathlin. So, the name of the language: Gaelc, Gaelk, a Gaelk, a Gaelk, a Gaelk. Not Gaeilge, not Gaelic, not Gaelic, a Gaelk, a Gaelk, a Gaelk. Very similar to how it's pronounced in the Isle of Man, in the Glens of Antrim, even on Meath, and the Isle of Arran, etc. How would you say welcome when somebody's coming in? You say Fáilte, Fáilte, just like anywhere else in Ireland, Fáilte. Maidin Mhath, Maidin Mhath, good morning. Maidin Mhath, Maidin Mhath, dʒiɑ or Maidin, dʒiɑ or Maidin, good morning. God be with you this morning. Now that's a very Catholic expression, obviously. The majority of the native speakers we have recorded and from whom notes were taken from were Catholics, so that they would say dʒiɑ or Maidin and dʒiä's mhaith back shouldn't be a surprise, although there were Protestant native speakers as well. So good day is Lama, Lahma, Lahma. Good evening is Coinfheascar mhaith, Coinfheascar mhaith, Coinfheascar mhaith. How are you? Kujemara or Kujemeratau, Kujemeratau or Kujemeratatu. Again, just like Ulster is today. People might also say Kujemeratatu a dollar te, Jemeratatu or dollar te, Jemeratatu or dollar hey. How are you getting on? How are you getting on? Kujemeratatu or dollar te. Tamagama, Tamagama, I'm well. Tamagama, Tamagama, I'm well. Ta ʃinње gama, we are well. Ta ʃinње gama, we are well. Ta ʃinње gama. This is very Rathlin, this next expression. I'm Midland. Tama meanach, Tama meanach, Tama meanach. I'm Midland, I'm just Midland. Tama meanach, Tama meanach. I'm sick or I'm feeling well. Tammy Gadonna, Tammy Gadonna. I'm sick or I'm feeling well. How would you say, what's your name? Could Terra my heart, could you Terra my heart, or could you Terra my heart, could you Terra my heart, could you Terra my heart, or could you Tanya my heart. Good night is ich va, ich va, ich va, ich va. Thank you is Gurumila Mad, Gurumila Mahat, Gurumila Mad. Just like in Connemara today, Gurumila Mad. The answer is Gurumad hey, Gurumad hey, thanks to yourself, Gurumad hey. Gurumad hey, thanks to yourself. Or Mashin lat, thanks to you. The same to you, same to you. Mashin lat, the same to you, the same to you. And goodbye in Rathlin is meanach lat, meanach lat, an expression which appears in Irish today, but it's considered very, very formal. So those are the basic phrases of Rathlin. Another thing I would say is, like all of East Ulster and North Donegal, the Irish of Rathlin used the negative particle, what we call the negative particle, ha. So, and no one would have said nirome, I wasn't. They would have said harome, I wasn't. Harome. So that's another thing, I suppose, which makes the language quite distinctive, as it was as from the Irish that people recognize today. I am taking a few notes off my computer just so I make sure that I get things right. Ideally, I can make more videos like this, and I suppose what I would do is I would respond to people asking me questions, really, because it's really difficult to know where to begin. In a sense, when I do this in Irish, it's easy because I just start with Irish. I just start with Irish as people would know, and then I change it. But when I'm beginning with perhaps trying to speak to people with no Irish at all, it's obviously a little bit more complicated. Now, I mentioned one thing before I go. There were dialects of Rathlin Irish. There was the upper end and lower end, and there was a wee bit of mixture in the middle. The upper end Irish survived a little bit longer, maybe 10 years, 20 years longer. And so we have a lot more of that on recording. We do have Bob McCormick from the lower end, although I don't know how much. I think he lived close enough to McCoig's the pub, so he might have been that lower end, I suppose. But he's definitely regarded as lower end, and there are clues in his speech that he was from the lower end. But you may say that the upper end speech was more Irish. Some people say that they were more Irish, and that the lower end speech was a little more Scottish, and that maybe the people were a little more Scottish. Certainly, when we look at people's ancestry of the native speakers that we've recorded, etc., the lower end people seem to have more Scottish ancestors than the people of the upper end. Now, when I say Scottish ancestors, I mean grandparents sort of level. So, how you would say away and the lower end was ar fáilte, basically like Scottish Gaelic today. But in the upper end, people would say ar huel for away, just like Irish today. Lower end people would say go shin, take that, go shin, whereas upper end people would have said gľac shin. So go shin and gľac shin. Lower end people would have said ceart go slór, okay, ceart go slór, whereas ceart go leor is what they would have said in the upper end. Do you know, I could talk about Rathlin for a long time, but I think I've made enough today just to give us a wee bit of a start, and I will come back to this subject again. And as I say, please ask me the questions, because that'll give me a little bit of direction as to what people would like to find out, if they want to find out. I do realise that a lot of people don't want to find out, because people have gone out of their way to tell me that. But okay, well, don't watch, that's okay. I also understand that some Irish language activists are a bit worried when people start talking about Rathlin Irish. This, take it whatever way you want. It's heritage, it's people's heritage. And I really don't know if it threatens anything else. If you're not into it, you're not into it. I'm certainly not telling people how they should speak or not to speak. But again, I would struggle really to make a case for any other kind of Irish in Rathlin Irish if that's what I was doing. And you know what? I'm not. I'm just talking about the dialect and trying to see if anyone else is interested. Unfortunately, there are not many people very much interested. I think that's a pity, but listen, we'll see. So, mar sin leat, agus beanach leat.